Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about families and children. Demographics. So the book opens up talking about childbearing and the concept of childbearing and what that involves, and then it also delves into, of course, the social change of childbearing and how that's changed over the last several centuries. And as you guys are beginning to discover, as society becomes more formal and legalities start to structure families and economics and things affect families, women's rights, all these other factors that are affecting childbearing, you're starting to see a change in that area. And you're also starting to see diversity when it comes to the family structure. Again, the typical nuclear family of a man and a woman and their children is only about 25%. Therefore, to account for real families in society, we need to account for all of the diversity. And whether that's single parents, single dads, single moms, same-sex couples, divorced couples, adopted couples, families being raised by their grandchildren. Okay, there's a lot of diverse family structure in the United States, and a lot of this comes from social change. And then who are the children living with is also a big question, because you're starting to see diversity. As divorce rates increase, for example, how does that affect the children? How does that affect the family structure? All good questions we should be asking. But this concept of a family structure consisting of just biological or people related to you through genetics is, not as common as it once was. And so you need to account for all the different family type diversity. And then how is that associated with childbearing? Then you need to account for all the new modern trends that are happening with changing gender roles and women's rights and all these other, again, factors that are affecting the family structure and who's living with who. Again, the rise of unmarried parents, and then you also have the rise of people living without children. Then you have to think about how variables such as race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, single parent status, all of these affect the varying fertility rates, okay? And so when you're talking about fertility rates, when you're looking at demographics, when you're looking at family structures, not only do you have to account for the diversity of family types, but you have to account for the diversity of the environments that children are being raised in, and then how different in family types are associated with children's outcomes and things along those lines. Again, think about like married couples have more socioeconomic status than single parents. So if you have this rise of single parents in modern times, a rise in cohabitation prior to marriage, how is that associated with the children's outcomes? And then race and ethnicity, of course, because then you start to add in the intersectional layers of that. And there's a rise of single parents in general, but for black females, for example, there's 70% of black females are single parents compared to 40% of white females. And then how is that associated with socioeconomic status and children's outcomes and why? You also see a rise in the education level. For white Americans are up to about 40%, Asian Americans are in the 60%. However, you see a disparity between black and Hispanic, which is in the 20% for getting bachelor's degrees. So again, how is bachelor's degrees associated with socioeconomic status, which is then associated with the structure of the family and the quality or the access of the family to be able to rise up the social class ladder? Okay, so again, these layers of race and ethnicity and economics and family types are all associated with the fertility rates. And then again, you have infertility defined as the inability to conceive a child. And then you have the rise of unmarried parents. When it comes to legalities, again, after the Civil War, you saw a great rise in the state and local and federal governments getting involved in marriage policies, abortion policies, foster care systems, institutions that structure the family, children's services, the entire bureaucracy that is attached to running the family system and guiding the policies and procedures associated with the family and the government. So again, when you're thinking about the association between the family and the government, you have to think about what is the government involved in. And again, adoption policies, foster care, So there's a lot involved there. You also do have some private involvement when it comes to abortion and things along those lines. But again, and also like taking care of children and adoption policies and things along those lines. But the federal and the state and the local governments are highly involved in these over modern times. Again, children's living arrangements. So the traditional gender roles have declined over time, whereas historically females were homemakers and males were providers. And how much of that's based in evolution and how much of that is a social construction, is a good question. And again, that's the biopsychosocial approach to gender roles, like why for thousands of years did we divide the labor according to genders? And is that based upon biology, or is that based upon a socially constructed society, whereas we socialize people to take on certain roles because of their sex or gender, okay? So again, because gender roles have changed, because women have rights, because minority groups have rights, they can now have access to education, to being able to take care of themselves, not as so dependent on men in modern times. For example, for women, you're starting to see a major decline in traditional gender roles and adoption of egalitarian gender roles, which is kind of more like whatever works best for the family. So you see this dynamic family structures increasing not only in diversity types and, the status of the parents, whether they're married, unmarried, cohabitating, single parents, but you're also starting to see a change in the roles. And for example, fathers in modern times spend 4 times as much time with their children as they did in the past, which is a great rise. But females are then working, and so they're not with their children as much physically. But what's really interesting is the book delves into this concept that even though women might be working more, they're actually spending more time and more quality time with their children, which is really interesting. But again, how much of that has to do with the guilt and shame from the gender role conflict that's associated with that? Because again, females, right, were historically socialized to stay home with the children. So when they don't stay home with the children, how do they feel? Do they feel that gender role conflict? And then men who are supposed to be providing, if they're home with the children, for example, and not working, and their wife, for example, is making money, do they experience gender role conflict and shame and stigmatization for being a stay-at-home dad? So again, you're starting to see this incredible diversity in the family structures, the types of families, the racial, ethnic compositions of families, interracial marriages, same-sex marriages, and then all of this is then associated with children's living arrangements. Again, how does divorce affect the children? And from a psychological perspective, every divorce is traumatic in some way on children, if only because it creates a change in the family structure itself. And so if you were to have a great debate about what is a stable family structure and what does that look like, that again, what you're really pointing out as all children really need is that stability, that love, that safety, and then, enough socioeconomic status so that they're not living in poverty. But again, the family structure itself is associated with whether or not you're in poverty. Again, being a single female historically was associated with the concept of the feminization of poverty, which then creates inequality between men and women, and then depending on your racial or your ethnic makeup, was associated with whether or not you could rise up the social class ladder. So just single black, single Hispanic females have lower socioeconomic status than single white females, and then how is that associated with children's living arrangements? So again, it's a very dynamic concept to really study this, but if you all are interested in it, again, you can look at each specific variable. Single black mother, single Hispanic mother, single white mother, single dads, single moms, same-sex couples, heterosexual couples, marriage couples that are cohabitating with the second person but aren't married yet, married couples that have remarried. And then the addition of, the cohabitating and the remarriage and the blending of a family of divorce. So you had a family that got divorced, then got remarried, and then how is that associated with children's living arrangements? And so again, what you tend to see is this is an incredibly complex process, and each variable needs to be accounted for. And you can't just assume that all families have the same experience, because what you're going to find is depending upon these variables, family type, marital status, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, age, are all associated with socioeconomic status and where you're located in the class system, which again is then associated with your children's living arrangements and their overall outcomes. Because again, who ends up with more educational attainment? Is it children in poverty or children not in poverty? And what you're going to find is those that are not in poverty have higher educational attainment rates than those who are in poverty. And so again, when you're looking at how economics and sex, biological sex and gender and sexual orientation and race and ethnicity are associated with not only the family structures but access to rising up the social class ladder, you're going to see that all of those variables are associated with inequality between groups. And so, I like to say, why do 60% of females who get pregnant in college drop out? That's a group we need to help, because if the females are dropping out because they're pregnant, is that associated with their educational attainment, their ability to get job prestige, their ability to get wealth, their ability to get cultural and social capital and rise up the social class ladder, okay? So again, these transition effects, unpredictable changes in the family structure are then associated with children's outcomes, and then psychological factors associated with the children, and also biological factors, especially when it comes to things like poverty and malnutrition, associated with families in poverty. And then what variables, again, are associated with children and families being more likely in poverty? That's when you have to look at race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and your marriage, family. Are you married? Are you not married? Are you a single parent? Are you cohabitating in a stable relationship? Are you cohabitating in a non-stable relationship? Is your family structure changing? Are there new relationships? All of these factors are associated with children's living arrangements. And again, the book talks about interpersonal relations, economics, divorce, abuse, moving, stress are all associated with the overall quality of life, the overall well-being of children in general. Parenting, you can take a functionalist perspective and talk about what's the purpose, what's the function of having a family, what's the purpose of parents taking on these roles. And again, it serves the needs of the children. One is socialization. So all of us are socialized into a culture, into a common way of life by agents of socialization, and our family are primary socializers, primary agents of socialization. And so we learn the language, the ideology, the beliefs, the value systems of our families. And that's associated with, the structure of our brain, the way we think, the way we behave, our norms, the expectations, and all of the above. It also fulfills needs of social bonds. And again, all of us need a hug. You can say you don't need people, but a baby doesn't develop unless we socialize that baby, interact with the baby, and babies need hugs. And we can look at the rhesus monkey experiment as an example. Again, does the monkey go to the mom for food, or does the monkey go to the mom for comfort? And again, what we find is, the rhesus experiment, that 90% of, babies crying out for people is that interaction, and 10% for food. So we really need that social interaction. The meaning of childhood, we've talked about this in the past, but that's changed over time. Whereas children historically were seen as economic units, now families are very devoted to developing children and, socializing them so that they can function in society and fulfill these roles and have a good, high quality of life, okay? So the social change and the idea of childhood and the function of childhood has changed over time. Parenting styles are associated with children and how they learn. Again, what's the best way? Is it discipline? Is it to be nice? Is it to be kind? And, again, what the book points out is, depending upon the social class that you're in, your socioeconomic status is associated with whether or not you say yes and are affirmative and say nice things to your kids, or whether you're constantly saying no and, not interacting with them as much. And this is why economics in the family matter, because people of higher economic status, higher socioeconomic status, they talk to their kids 4 times as much as people in poverty, way more involved. And then how is that associated with overall intelligence? And this is a dark, dark story. But when you teach psychology, you have to teach that your socioeconomic status, the schools you go to, how much food you ate, whether you ate today, all of these factors are associated with overall intelligence. And depending upon your social class, the lower your social class tends to be, the more you expect natural development. You don't really push the rocket science, the physics, the challenging stuff. But when you study Vygotsky, you find that humans don't just naturally learn rocket science. It takes work. And people of higher socioeconomic statuses that go to better schools, that challenge their kids more, that force them to learn more younger, and through time, tend to have higher intelligence levels. And again, that's the dark side of it all, because your family's socioeconomic status is associated with, again, your overall ability to rise up the social class ladder, gain access to the rising up the social class ladder, learning key skills and knowledge, learning crystallized knowledge, very and fluid knowledge. So it's a dark, dark story, but that kind of stuff matters. So your socioeconomic status, your parenting styles, again, things to be thinking about. Family and parenting styles, again, are socially constructed. They're culturally constructed because, again, different cultures have different ways they raise their children. And then parenting styles, when you look at it in psychology, they usually have the 4-tier methods of parenting style: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, etc. But, again, are these biological parenting styles? Is this built into our genetics, or are these social constructs? Okay? But again, in modern times, we're focusing more on developing children. But again, these insecurities associated with childhood are then associated with your socioeconomic status and things along those lines. So we have to be considering those factors. The book defines this concept of intensive motherhood, disparities in cultural expectations. And again, moms actually spend more time with their children now than in the past. And I love that question, why? And again, I think it goes a lot to gender role conflict and things along those lines. But again, even though women are working more, they're spending more time with their kids in modern times, which kind of sounds like a misnomer, but that's what the statistics say. Again, inequalities in parenting relate to the socioeconomic status and, how much time you spend with your children. And again, your book talks about that. And that's what's really sad, is that your socioeconomic status is associated with your investment in your actual children in the end, which is then associated with their overall development in the end. Discipline, supportiveness, monitoring, corporal punishment, what are the best methods of child rearing? I'm not going to address that because, again, those are such opinionated concepts, but just to get you thinking about all the different methods and ways from which we can raise children. Okay? But again, the most important thing for kids is just love and safety. That's what they really need the most. If a kid is loved and safety, mental illness tends to go down and all the other social problems that can result. When it comes to LGBTQ+, again, we need a lot more data. This is a very new concept. I've spent the last couple of years looking at the stigmatization of children, for example, and the stigmatization of parents of same-sex couples. And when you look at negative prejudice and discrimination from heterosexual couples, heterosexual couples have these completely not founded in science beliefs that, like, a same-sex couple is associated with their children's sexual orientation, and it's not. Your parents' sexual orientation has nothing to do with your children's sexual orientation. And exposing people to different cultures has nothing to do with your sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is this biopsychosocial process, but the majority of it's simply genetics. We need more data, though, to really study the effects of LGBTQ+, and then intersex, asexual status upon family living arrangements and things along those lines. Because again, 0.5% of couples right now are same-sex marriage. So we have very little data. It's a brand new concept. It just became acceptable in modern times. The legal status has changed. This is very recent, 2013. But again, no association with children's sexual orientation, but we have to consider the stigmatization effects because children of same-sex couples, for example, will experience some form of stigmatization effects because stigmatization effects exist in our society because negative prejudice and discrimination exists. So the only way to really help those children is the end of negative bias. Again, fatherhood in modern times, the male provider ideal versus the involved father ideal has changed over time. Historically, again, the males were not expected to interact with their children. And now males are all over interacting with their children. Okay, and again, this relates to what we were talking about with the change in traditional gender roles from traditional to egalitarian. The book does point out that 24% of males have multiple families. But the time of day with children is 4 times as much as it used to be in 1975. So again, hopefully you're seeing that the family structure has changed over time, that historical family, the nuclear family is withering away into a minority. Now you're starting to see incredible diversity, but each variable in that diversity is intersectionally related to socioeconomic status, rising up the social class, your culture that you identify with, how you socialize your children, etc. So a lot going on. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.